of the main things that I do is I litigate cases involving religious liberty and pro-life and free speech, marriage and family, things like that, for an organization called Alliance Defending Freedom. And so one of my hopes is that in addition to kind of doing the day-to-day legal work that the state of Michigan Knights of Columbus need, is to occasionally speak to you about some of these important issues. And so today I've got a few minutes to talk to you about the importance of religious liberty and what our role is in maintaining freedom to practice our religion here in the United States. Now first, the good news. As you know, the United States is one of the most free countries in the world when it comes to practicing our religion. In fact, that's the reason that we were founded. People were escaping from England and other places in Europe where either they were being coerced to practice the government's religion or they were being prohibited from practicing their religion. And so our entire Constitution, going right back to the First Amendment, guarantees our right to free exercise. That's really, really good news. Another piece of good news is that right now at the U.S. Supreme Court, we are having the biggest winning streak for religious liberty that our country has ever seen. Over roughly, yeah, that's Bursch. Over roughly the last 12 to 14 years, 24 out of 25 religious liberty cases have gone in favor of the Religious Liberty Party. That's pretty remarkable, and we have our Supreme Court to thank for that. Now there's a couple of bad newses as well. First, the reason that we have so many religious liberty victories at the Supreme Court is because so many lower court judges refuse to recognize religious liberty. So for example, Jack Phillips, you might remember him, he was the master baker, the cake artist in Colorado. And he was persecuted because he would not create a cake celebrating a same-sex wedding. And he ultimately won based on religious liberty in the United States Supreme Court, but he lost at every level of the court system until then. Another example is Hobby Lobby, a very large company that is privately held by a family that infuses its religious beliefs in everything that it does in its stores. And the Supreme Court ultimately vindicated their right on religious liberty grounds not to have to put abortifacients in their health insurance policy, but again, after losing at many levels of the court system. More recently, in the pandemic era, you have the Diocese of Brooklyn. It was one of many dioceses across the United States which was suffering from government officials who are refusing to allow churches to either open or to have any reasonable number of people in them. At the cathedral in the Diocese of Brooklyn, it could hold more than 1,000 people, and yet the city of New York only allowed them to have 10 people together at one mass, while they allowed warehouses and strip clubs and other places to have as many people in close proximity as they wanted. Won that one too. Or Coach Kennedy, you may have heard his story. He was a football coach out on the West Coast, and he lost his job because the school didn't want him praying after football games with some of his players. And ultimately, the Supreme Court said he was doing that on his own time. He could have used that time to call people, to look up sports scores on ESPN, and the government had no ability to tell him when he could pray. And he won at the Supreme Court, but again, he lost at all of the lower levels of the court system. And all of these cases are a function of the really concerning thing about religious liberty in the United States today. And that is at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, government officials are doing more to persecute people of faith than at any time since our country's founding. And we can see that right here in Michigan. We have a legislature and a governor who have recently enacted laws, for example, that extend protections to people who have same-sex attraction or gender ideology. They identify as the opposite sex. And all those people should be treated with dignity and respect. It's part of our Catholic teaching. But at the same time, there are certain things that Catholic churches and fraternal organizations and businesses and individuals can't do because it violates our religious faith. And yet, when asked, the legislature, they turn down any religious exemption. So as a result, right now in Michigan, we have Catholic schools like Sacred Heart in Grand Rapids and St. Joseph's in Lansing, which have filed lawsuits, and they're in the court system right now because it would be illegal under Michigan law for them to hire teachers that follow the Catholic faith. It would be unlawful for them to take something like the church's teachings on same-sex marriage and put them on their website. It would be illegal for them to tell a boy who identifies as a girl that he can't shower with the girls and be on the girls' sports teams. That's one of the ways that religious liberty is being circumscribed here in the state of Michigan. Another example that the legislature with the governor's help passed a counseling censorship law. And it says that if a counselor wants to counsel someone to engage in a same-sex relationship or to encourage someone to identify as the opposite sex, they're free to do that. But if they would encourage someone to follow the church's teachings on marriage or the church's teachings on human sexuality, they can actually lose their counseling license. And so there's lawsuits that are being filed to fight that as well. And so as Knights, the question is, what can we do about this? And there's two things that I want to say to you today that I hope you can take with you. The first is to know that everyone who is employed by an employer anywhere in the United States that's of a sufficient size has a right to a religious accommodation under federal law. The law known as Title VII, which prohibits things like discrimination based on race or sex in employment, also provides a robust religious accommodation. So if you're working for even a private employer, much less a public employer, and your employer wants you to use preferred pronouns at work, wants you to wear an ally pin during Pride Month, or take other steps that violate your Catholic faith, you have the right to ask for a religious accommodation. And if the employer won't do that, then you have the right to go to court and to challenge them on that. And usually, employers in Michigan will back down when confronted with someone who's asking for a religious accommodation because they don't want to go to court over these things. It makes them look bad and it's expensive. There's nothing good in it for the company. And so it's important that all of us know that, but that all of the other people that we know in our councils and in our parishes, that they know that too, that you don't have to bow to the agendas of employers when it violates our religious faith. The other thing that I want to urge all of you to do, and to spread this to your family members to do as well, is to encourage others to recognize the importance of religious liberty. If we look back at the history, not only of the United States, but of the world, Western civilization was built by the Catholic Church. Why do I say that? The Catholic Church is responsible for hospitals, for orphanages, for foster care, for libraries, for universities, for homeless shelters. It just goes on and on and on. All of the great social institutions, many of which are run by the government today, started as efforts of the Catholic Church, and many of them continue to be run by the Catholic Church. And so when the government starts to infringe religious liberty, what does that mean? It means pushing religion, including the Catholic Church, out of the public square. And so people need to understand that when the religious denominations, including the Catholic Church, are marginalized and they're not allowed to do what they want to do in the public square, we lose all those vital services. We lose foster care and adoption agencies, which are Catholic. We lose foster care and adoptive families who are Catholic. We lose Catholic hospitals. We lose prison ministries. We lose our homeless shelters. All these great things that result in flourishing in all of our communities are only possible because of religious liberty. Now, it wasn't that long ago that people understood the importance of religious liberty. If you go back to the 1970s, when the U.S. Supreme Court made a mistake and they issued the Roe versus Wade opinion, immediately there was a groundswell at the federal government and in almost every state that granted religious liberty protections to doctors and nurses and hospitals that they wouldn't have to participate in abortion. Because as a country, we recognized that religious liberty was important to human flourishing. Well, that's not that way anymore. Today, people talk about those religious exemptions as licenses to discriminate, which is the most ridiculous thing possible. And so it's our job as members of the Knights to go out into the culture and teach, to remind people that it's religious liberty that our country was founded on, and religious liberty that will keep our country flourishing in the future. So that's my mission for all of you, to take from here, to go do something about this by talking to your neighbor, talking to your fellow employees at work, talking to family members, and spreading the good news about why we value religious liberty in the United States. Now, one last point that I want to make about religious liberty, about a very recent U.S. Supreme Court case, and then I'm going to close, because it's so important to what we're talking about. You may have heard about the FDA abortion pill case that was at the U.S. Supreme Court. And I was part of that case. I was litigating that case on behalf of pro-life doctors who did not want to participate in abortions in the emergency room when someone took an abortion pill at home and then had a problem and needed to have that abortion completed when they went to the hospital. And many of us were disappointed because the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously threw that case out on standing. They said that the pro-life doctors weren't allowed to sue. And so some of the good things that could have come out of that lawsuit did not. But what was lost in all the headlines in the New York Times and on CNN and the Washington Post is why the Supreme Court said there was no standing. It's because the U.S. government conceded, after taking the opposite position for years, that doctors and hospitals could exercise their religious liberty rights in emergency rooms, notwithstanding federal law. And so that was the silver lining in that case, that even though we didn't get a big win on the abortion pill like we would have liked, that the court protected religious liberty. But the court can continue to protect religious liberty only so long as all the rest of us make sure that we keep that issue front and center everywhere that we go. And so with that, I'll just admonish you that you do everything that you can to celebrate religious liberty among everyone you know, or otherwise we won't be able to have organizations like this in 10 or 20 years. Our ability to practice our Catholic faith in the public square will be forever compromised. At Alliance Defending Freedom, our motto is keep the doors open for the spread of the gospel. And I want all of you to spread not only the gospel of the church, but the gospel of religious liberty. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.